This LOS is describe differences in voting rights and other ownership characteristics among different equity classes. Types and characteristics of equity securities. So we're going to look at some bullet points here. First, the common shares represent an ownership interest in a company. So common shares are ownership, and they give investors a claim on its operating performance, the opportunity to participate in the corporate decision-making process, that's through the voting, and a claim on companies' net assets in the case of liquidation. So as we've seen on the balance sheet, assets equals liabilities plus equity. So assets minus liabilities equals equity. So if we sold all the assets and paid all the debts, what's left over is the residual claim to the equity shareholders. Now we're going to look at two features here, common shares that could be callable or puttable, okay? So callable common shares give the issuer the right to buy back the shares from the shareholders at a price determined when the shares are originally issued. Okay, so when we look at options, options give the holder, the buyer, the right but not the obligation, in this case, the right but not the obligation to buy back the shares. So you can see here, the issuer owns the option when it's callable. So they've bought it. So that means the shareholder has sold that option, okay? They would receive a option premium for that. So the price of a callable common share would be less than the price of a normal common share, because the buyer has received a bit of a premium from the seller, who is the issuing company, to get that right. Now, a puttable common shares give shareholders the right to sell the shares back to the issuer at a price specified when the shares are issued. So in that case, the price of a puttable share would be more than a common share without that option on it, because the shareholder has bought that right. Okay, so that's an important concept to understand, not too difficult. And finally, preference shares are a form of equity in which payments are made to preference shareholders take precedence, that's why they're called preferred, over any payments to common shareholders. And we've seen there's different types of preferred shares. They can be participating, in which case they're going to receive an additional dividend if a company has hit certain targets, or they could be cumulative, which means that if the preferred dividend has not been paid, it must be paid before any dividends can be paid to common shareholders. So continuing with types and characteristics of equity securities. So as we said, cumulative preference shares are preference shares on which dividend payments are accrued, so that any payments omitted by the company must be paid before another dividend can be paid to common shareholders. Non-cumulative preference shares have no such provision, implying that the dividend payments are at the company's discretion and are thus similar to payments made to common shareholders. Participating preference shares allow investors to receive the standard preferred dividend plus the opportunity to receive a share of corporate profits above a pre-specified amount. Non-participating preference shares allow investors simply to receive the initial investment plus any accrued dividends in the event of liquidation. Finally, callable and puttable preferred shares provide issuers and investors with the same rights and obligations as their common share counterparts. So again, a callable preferred, it's the issuer that has the right to call the shares back. So they have bought that option, and the seller is the shareholder, has sold that, so the price would be lower than a similar share with no option attached to it. And the puttable preferred shares would be lower risk to the investor because they have the right but not the obligations to put those shares back to the issuer. Okay. Again, just going over the difference between statutory non-cumulative voting and cumulative voting with regards to common shares. Of course, common shares vote, preference shares do not typically vote. So let's consider an owner of 100 shares of common stock when 3 board members are to be elected. With statutory non-cumulative voting, shareholders can give a maximum of 100 votes to each of 3 candidates. With cumulative voting, shareholders can give maximum of 300 votes to 1 candidate, and this allows minority shareholders to gain board seats. So we'll just do a quick practice question to finish this LOS. The type of equity voting right that grants 1 vote for each share of equity owned is referred to A, proxy voting, B, statutory voting, or C, cumulative voting. And that question's not too difficult. The type of equity voting right that grants one vote for each share of equity owned is referred to as statutory voting. So B is correct. Statutory voting is the type of equity voting right that grants one vote per share owned. And that's the last slide for this LOS. Thank you.